Relatively short video on Chapter 2 Teams and Team Behavior in Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. This is the third installment of the skeleton key to Goffman's famous book. Last time, I sort of really strongly emphasized that Goffman has, that underneath Goffman's work is a kind of dialectical theory of social life. In that, we as modern performers, modern selves, work to generate something like spontaneous psychological involvement or psychological engrossment, or at least socially effective immersion in ongoing scripts, a kind of automatic belief in the reality status of the roles that we play, and so on. In other words, individuals come to believe to a degree, for the moment that the performance is taking place, that they and the role that they're playing have merged into one. And that the audience that's observing that performance takes that performer as the performed self, right? So let's say you have an actor, say Benedict Cumberbatch, is that how you say his name, who plays Richard III. If he does it effectively, if the dramaturgy is artful enough, the audience who observes the performance will no longer see the actor Benedict Cumberbatch playing Richard III. They're going to see Richard III come to life. That the existential being of the performer, the psychobiological sac with capabilities and so on, has fully invested itself in the animation of the mask, and for the moment, that seems to be all that there is, something along those lines. So, spontaneous psychological involvement, the accent of reality falls upon or is attached to the unfolding performance, and the reality status of the performed self seems to completely capture the performer. Okay? So this is a sort of interaction ideal. We want to stage the world in such a way that there is sufficient psychological involvement, spontaneous psychological involvement, so that the world's work gets done. Okay? All right. In order to do that, Goffman argues, negative experience has to be negated or avoided or canceled in some way, right? So this is like the Ghostbusters signal, the negation of negative experience. You want to cancel it out. So remember, negative experience occurs when the definition of the situation, the DOS, which is the answer to the question, what is going on, right, falls apart. And at that moment, there's no longer a script, there's no longer social roles that are being distributed and that act upon. The accent of reality disappears, and those who are co-present in the middle of the of the performance begin to struggle to figure out the answer to that question, what is going on. So the accent of reality disappears, we no longer know who we are, and like I tried to argue last time, underneath all social roles are beings of violence and beings of dangerous beings. That the only animals we really worry about are other human beings. So in negative experience, we confront each other as existential self to existential self, tooth, claw, muscles, danger, and so that's where we descend. So negative experience emerges when spontaneous psychological involvement in an organized social role or an organized social performance disappears. So again, the great collective behavior tradition in sociology, Turner, Killian, and others, Herbert Blumer, really study the process of loss of structure, and at that moment, people can search around to try to figure out what is going on. They keynote, they try to determine emergent norms and those kinds of things. Okay, so again, this is very traumatic to descend into negative experience. Hence, there is a moral imperative in the modern world to keep performances going and to defend ongoing performances and roles and to protect them, right, with tactful disattention to disruptions and so on. So there's again this big moral pressure to keep things going. Okay, so that was all good, well and good, and it's really important to have learned that. So you try to keep discrepancies, you try to keep coherence, right? So that the only the aspects of being of the existential person, right, that fit the role are exhibited, are apparent. So you try to have a coherent performance. So again, if you're playing somebody like Richard III and you have a kindly nature, you're going to suppress that kindly nature because Richard III is one of theater's great bastards, right? So you're going to want to make sure that evil nature of Richard III comes across. So kindliness, thoughtfulness, gentleness, tenderness, those kind of things that might be part of one's character are suppressed so that the performed self appears coherent with Richard III's theatrical persona. So that's what we mean by coherent. So you're limiting disruptions, limiting incoherent expressions, so that spontaneous psychological involvement can take place. So negative experience then emerges when this falls apart, so disruptions and so on, and it gets people to start asking the question, what is going on? So people are no longer placing an accent of reality upon the performance, they're placing an accent of reality upon the existential reality of just, of being fearful of the others around and trying to figure out what indeed might be happening. Okay, so in chapter 2 of the book, then, Goffman extends his argument and he goes beyond an analysis of individual performers, and he instead focuses our attention upon performance teams. So the chapter is called Teams. And so here you've got, so this is the basic image I want you to have, is that performance teams are composed of individual performed selves, individual parts, right? So it's like the cast in a play is the performance team. The director is behind the scenes, also part of the performance team. The people who do the stage work and lighting are also part of the performance team. And then the actors on stage as well. So that's your performance team, sort of the cast and crew of that helps a staged reality come across. So we rarely work as individuals, we generally work as part of performance teams, and when we do present ourselves as individuals, we're acting as a sort of one-person performance team that's doing all the differentiated roles that would normally be done by specialists, right? So if you're doing, you're self-producing a theatrical performance, doing a monologue, something like that, you're doing all of the roles that would otherwise be performed by different people. Okay. So what you're performing is a definition of the situation, or at least you're keynoting it. You're allowing people to infer what the definition of the situation is, and you do it by maintaining coherence, performative coherence, right? You're presenting a coherent self with minimum discrepancies in order to keep the world going. Now, in this section on teams, we're going to learn that performance teams are doubled, that there's always two. That you never perform to yourself, you're performing to audiences. And that audiences in the modern world aren't mere passive individuals separated from each other, but themselves constitute a performance team. Okay? So the audience is a performance team that's performing audience in front of a performance team that's performing in front of them, and all of the actors working together generate and maintain something like a performance, a social reality, a scripted social reality with social roles and parts. Okay. So as an individual performer, what you're really doing is finding yourself a position within a performance team and then enacting, that's in alignment with another performance team, an audience, and you're acting in a coherent way, right, with expressive control and so on to make sure that the performance goes on unimpeded. Okay. So there we are. So here is an image of a Greek theater. And what we see here is a stage, a setting. More on that in the next chapter. But we can see that we have the actors on stage. We have the person here who is the star, at least of the moment. The star of the show is the person who has what Goffman calls dramatic dominance, right? And backstage somewhere may well be the director. who does the hiring and the firing and the training and controls things and runs the show, takes the tickets, gets the money and so on. And that person has what Goffman calls directive dominance. They may not even appear ever within the diegetic reality of the performance. They may never be seen, but they nevertheless control what takes place. So the star of the show has dramatic dominance. All of the people who are involved, including the backstage director who has directive dominance power, they all work together as a performance team. And then the audience themselves, again, work together as a performance team. If you got, we don't go to films these days because of coronavirus, but in the days when you could go to films, audiences often work together to shush each other up, to make sure that phones are shut off, to keep each other sort of in control. And then they keynote against each other, laughing at appropriate points, applauding, and so on, right? So there's a kind of cooperation and a performance of the role of spectator. So they're functioning as a performance team. So there's the two great teams in the social world. The performance team, who owns the stage, right, who has what he calls home team dominance, and controls the setting, and the audience, which is the second team, also a performance team that stands in structural relation to them, and it is all working together who generate the reality status of social life, right? So the performance team, the actors and the director and so on, defend the performance underway by maintaining, dramatic, expressive coherence and so on, other things, keeping those discrepancies at bay. And the audience protects the performance by tactfully overlooking flaws and, again, working together to keep the performance going underway. Okay, so let's sort of leave some of that out. Okay, leave that out, yeah. Okay, yeah, we'll just sort of leave all of this out. We don't need this right now. So there it is. So page 79, Goffman argues that social life is not spontaneously released. It's not overly structured where people just sort of live. Instead, it requires a kind of active realization of social life. It's not spontaneous or naive or created afresh. It is instead performed, coordinated, rehearsed, and prescripted. So on the one hand, Goffman's making a structural argument that the world is not sort of created in a kind of improv along the way, but is instead a reenactment of pre-existing social rituals and social scripts, and social plays and social roles. That's all true, but that doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't just happen by the right people getting in the right positions. Instead, it occurs because people adopt social roles and then use their energy to make certain that reality is maintained with performances, expressive coherence, expressive discipline, and so on. Okay, so it's an active, participative version of social structure, right? So social structure is this repertoire of scripts, of parts, of the arts of impression managed that have been sort of drilled into children and developed in their socialization, right? That's sort of what social structure is composed of, but it has to be actively realized by individuals adopting social roles, existential selves giving up their energy to make sure that the social world unfolds. Okay. All right, so on page 80, two qualities performance teams, reciprocal dependence and reciprocal familiarity. So this is really important. So Goffman argues that once you're a member of a performance team, you really are dependent upon your fellow performers. So you can be an excellent basketball player, for example, and if your teammates let you down, you can't really show your stuff, something like that. You can be a really good actor, and if your fellow actors don't know their lines, flub their lines all the time, you can't do it. You're really dependent upon people. You're dependent upon them in the moment, and then as Goffman is going to tell us, you're also dependent upon them to keep quiet and suppress the secrets that they learn about you, your existential self, and about the other social roles you can play. The discrepancies between the performed self and the existential self, right? Those things, they have to learn to keep that dark or keep those secrets quiet. So this becomes one of the main things that happen, that once you're a member of a performance team, you become vulnerable to a kind of social blackmail, because your teammates come into possession of secrets, right? They know how your existential being differs from the part that you play. Okay, and then you engage in something called reciprocal familiarity. So all of the members of a performance team are mutually blackmailable because you're all working together backstage. You all are aware of each other's secrets, and you're all working together in a familiar way, interacting not as using that picture that we had earlier. So members of a performance team relate to each other actor to actor, performer to performer, instead of just role or social role or perform self to perform self. So they interact with each other backstage. If you've ever been in a play, you'll see this, where people will help each other get into costume. They'll make sure that the makeup is correct. They'll help prompt each other if someone forgets their lines and so on. So you're interacting in a much more intimate fashion, right, than you would if you were just a mere audience member on the other side. So Goffman calls this familiarity. So the word comes from family, right? So you're like family. So you have intimacy, but performance team members don't necessarily like each other. They certainly don't have to love each other. So it's intimacy without warmth, the kind of cool, necessary mutual exposure, and again, a sharing of secrets that places the team into a kind of a situation of mutual blackmail. Page 84, cliques are performance teams. So what's really interesting, Goffman claims that if you take something like a group of colleagues, if you cut them in half, you can wind up with a clique, right? So cliques form when you get a group of colleagues that create an out-group, and then they turn the clique into a performance team that excludes others. So you get a performance team that begins to look after each other's back, share secrets and intimacy and so on. And then it divides up a group of colleagues into various cliques that perform vis-a-vis each other. So if you've seen the great film Mean Girls, or if you've lived through middle school or high school, you'll understand this, that cliques form, create kind of exclusionary groups that share secrets and that mutually perform, so that the queen bee and the elites around her perform their popularity in a way different from the band, the band geeks, that kind of thing. Okay. All right. So definitions of situations then have to be structured in order for teams to properly project them. You have to have a working consensus. The members of a performance team have to share some idea of what's happening and what's about to happen and what the roles are and so on. And so Goffman claims that this happens, right? That there has to be kind of like an effective unanimity of agreement on that the working consensus doesn't have to be totally bought into in all of its dimensions, but it has to be effective, right? That there has to be some shared agreement among members of a performance team what the main performance is, what we're trying to get across, and so on, right? So this means that there's backstage teaching that goes on, rehearsals, social control exerted and so on to make sure that the members of a performance team know the script, know their roles, and adhere to the performance on stage. So Goffman argues that in modern life, almost all situations or performances break down into the rule of two. There's generally two teams, and the two teams are, of course, the performance team and the audience. And of course, to him, the audience is always also a performance team. That's the two. The performance team, which is which? Well, the performance team, again, has the home court advantage, possesses the stage, possesses the setting, that kind of thing. When I lecture in a classroom, I'm the performance team because I have access to the keys, to the equipment, and so on, and I have a, sort of like the legitimate job to be in class and to be teaching. Students, less so, right? Okay. So those are the two teams. So it's really the possession of the home court or of the setting, and then a kind, that the social role itself, that the active performance falls upon the performance team instead of the audience, right? Okay. Division of performance team roles. There's three. So the performance team has a division of labor. The three roles are the star, who has dramatic dominance, the director, right? The director, who has directive dominance, often, again, not seen, right, backstage. Alfred Hitchcock was famous for making small cameos in his films where he would briefly appear as a minor backstage character. But in fact, here the third role is ceremonial roles, otherwise known as furniture. So in that image we were just looking at a few moments ago of the Greek theater, all right, here's our star with dramatic dominance, and here we have the furniture. These are people who are ceremonially present, but not really doing much, right? They're just there to sort of flesh out the cast, the extras in a film set or something like that, right? I was once a non-speaking shark in a performance of West Side Story, and during much of the performance, I had a few like sort of on-site, fight scenes or something where I was sort of center stage. But in much of the play, I was just sort of background, right? I was one of the chorus, as it were, right? So it's sort of backstage. So that's the third role, is the furniture, the backstage people. In a wedding, the bride is usually like, the star. Probably like a wedding planner or something like that is going to be the person with directive dominance. And then like the bridesmaids and bridegrooms, that kind of thing. Bridesmaids and groomsmen, groomsmen are going to be the furniture, right? The people who are playing merely ceremonial roles. I was an altar boy as a kid growing up in a Catholic church, and altar boys really aren't needed, to be real honest with you. You're really playing a ceremonial role. By playing the part of a servant to a priest, you're sort of reenacting a kind of, you're sort of signaling the kind of, high status of the priest or something like that, or that there's something like a true sort of magical ceremony underway that requires assistance. But mostly you're there just again to lend a tone to the performance. Okay, so that's the division of labor, right? The furniture. Okay. Page 104, Goffman writes about the sweet guilt of conspirators that all performance teams are secret societies. So we know right now in the Trump administration, as people are leaving the Trump administration or going to prison out of the Trump administration or cashing in big on the Trump administration, they're often writing books, the tell-all book, right? So the secrets that were learned as a member of the performance team, the backstage, the conspiratorial guilt that you have from being backstage, you can release into the public, tell the secrets, and cash in for millions of dollars, right? Michael Cohen is currently involved in doing that, even as we speak, right? So that sweet guilt of conspirators, as a member of a performance team. All right, and so the big difference, this is like I tried to emphasize in the first video. High modern life is dominated by performances and performance team behavior. Traditional society isn't. So I have here this image, if I can find the thing for you, is that if you look at traditional societies, of course, as soon as I want an image, I can't get it for you. But anyway, if you look at traditional societies, you wake up, you never have a new, right? There is no such thing as a first impression. All of the people that you're surrounded by have known you since time out of mind, right? And you don't get up in the morning and perform a role as an actor. You get up in the morning and go to work. So if you work on, like let's say you're born in a traditional society with living on a farm in a peasant village somewhere with cattle and chickens and neighbors. You don't have to get up in the morning and perform. You just go out and feed the chickens, right? Or you milk the cattle. You're not worrying about getting your makeup right and getting your hair good before you go out and hand milk Bessie the cow. You're just doing it. So traditional life, weeding bean fields or hauling hay or flailing crops after they're harvested, that kind of work is just work. You're just doing work. You're using your muscular apparatus to produce. In the modern world, right? Even when you're doing work in production, there's often a layer of performance added on to it. So in the modern world, the scripts become much more differentiated, develop fragmented multiplicities of scripts, right? And it means that actors and actresses or that modern people must become actors and actresses in order to ensure that all of these multiple roles are played with good effect, right? And so, as we sort of talked about last time in performances, that every person, again, this is your existential self, right? Existential self, otherwise known as the performer, right? Or the actor. And these are the performed selves. Sorry for the writing. Selves or social roles. Each of which is tied to a fundamental institution of some kind, right? So you have a social role in your family, you have a social role in school, you have a social role in work, and so on. And so the actor has to be able to play all of these differentiated roles at once. And that's something different than in a traditional society that have something like a monoculture and a monostructure, such that the authority relations in the family are also the authority relations at work and are also the authority relations of politics and so on, right? But there's just one structure. Here, in the modern world, the authority relations at school are different. You have to behave the teacher, who has a different standard of judgment than your parents and so on. Maybe your parents are divorced, and even in the family you have multiple roles that you must play and interact differently when in one household versus another. In school, you have different friendship groups that might call forth a slightly different self and so on. So it becomes very, very problematic, right? All modern people have to balance this. So even when you go to work, and your work is physical, right? You're doing physical labor, there's always this added element of performance added onto it, and that this is different from traditional society, okay? So in a nutshell, modern society is composed of the things that Goffman writes about: teams, team behavior, performances, expressive coherence. People have to know a kind of background understanding of the different social roles and scripts. You have to ensure that people know these things and can comprehend them. And that this is distinct from the traditional world, where authority structures are so much more unified, and that you can kind of live with a kind of basic background understanding that doesn't require much in the way of again, active management and so on. I think that brings us to the end of chapter 2, so we'll go on from there. So I hope you found this useful.